Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Drobo Broadcast Network. My name is Mario Blandini at Drobo, and I'm joined today by George Crump, who is a senior analyst and president with Storage Switzerland LLC, an analyst firm that has expertise all across the board. How are you doing today, George?
I'm doing great, Mario. Thanks for having me.
Well, welcome back. I said in our first webcast that we did together that you're not just the Hair Club president, you're also a client. And in this case, you're also a small business. And I think it's fitting that you help walk us through how we can compare different offsite backup solutions for protection of unstructured data. The question we have for everybody is the plan you have on file for your offsite backup working for you? We're about to find out. Your background, George, you're a small business, and I'll let everybody know out there what your services are and what areas you tend to focus on. But in addition to your expertise, you run a small business, and you think about business continuity and off-site backup all the time. So tell us what your frame of reference is.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. We struggle with much of the same small business challenges as it relates to DR that any small business would be. You would think that because we're in the industry, we'd, have the whole thing figured out. But, what I always tell people is we don't have an excuse. I can't call anybody up and say, oh, well, we lost that file because everybody expects us to keep it. So, and we also have the same problem that because of the business, we're flooded with tons of different options, and they range in all kinds of degrees of difficulty and things like that. As far as what we do, we're an analyst firm. We focus on the storage marketplace in particular, hence the name. We do a lot of product testing as well as article writing, blogs, things like that. But from a mission-critical standpoint, the content we create, the videos we produce, the audio that we produce, it really becomes our product, and losing that product can become a big problem for us in the future.
Well, everyone knows that traditional tape vaulting is one way to make sure you get your data offsite. A lot of folks are looking at cloud-based backup as well as an approach to getting their data offsite. But recovery time is something we'll focus on in this session, because in addition to getting the stuff offsite, you want to make sure you can recover both consistently and quickly. Everybody knows they got to be doing it, and we'll look at ways that you can do it in a quick and simple way.
Yeah, just to give you a quick anecdotal story, about 2.5 years ago when the business was really starting to grow, we lost our primary file server, and although we had it backed up, and I'm as guilty as the next guy, I kicked myself, but we didn't factor in recovery time. Well, in our world where we're judged on content posted per day and things like that, we couldn't post content because essentially although our hosting service was down, the stuff we needed to update, we couldn't get to them because we had to wait for the entire recovery effort to complete. So that sort of was my wake-up call that, oh, wow, I'm running a real business. I've got to make sure we've got this stuff nailed from a business perspective.
Absolutely. Folks know that disasters can happen, and the outage you're talking about is probably more commonplace than a disastrous fire, as we show you here on the slide. So I think everyone probably understands, George, why you need to put your data off-site. But if we're thinking about DR, or off-site backup in the context of an SMB, you may not need synchronous mirroring between storage arrays across the planet. The needs are probably a little more simple, just to protect from a disaster and to get that data back quickly. Walk us through what the needs are from an SMB perspective.
Sure. I think the big thing is to get it into a physically different site, preferably some distance away. I don't want you to replicate it to an office building across the street as an example, because a realistic disaster could be an area of downtown flooding. Right? We had some clients that we worked with in Houston probably about 6-7 years ago now, where the whole downtown area got flooded because a tropical storm stopped over the city. Data centers that were on the ground floor and then replicated to data centers on the ground floor across the street were both out of commission, right? So we recommend some distance, but to your point, it doesn't have to be around the world. Another city's ideal, but even if it's 20, 30 miles away, as an example, is generally a good process. The other thing we recommend is that data be in what I call an accessible format, meaning it's not in a backup format. You can deploy it almost immediately. You don't have to go through a lengthy recovery process. Your backup has its, and stored in that format has its role, but from a disaster recovery standpoint, where what you want to be able to do is get back to your latest copy, and in my world was upload the website, right? All I needed was the exact latest version of information. The other thing is it's got to be simple. Simple is a dangerous word because everybody tends to co-opt it, but if it's not something that you can use without thinking about it or that automatically happens, then chances are you're not going to do it on a consistent basis. And especially in DR, where we're talking about give me my latest copy, the fact that whatever you were doing worked a week ago or a month ago, if it's not working right now, doesn't do you a lot of good. And then finally, I think, especially in the SMB space, it's got to be cost effective. If you're not going to pay 10x what you pay for primary storage to keep your data safe, it's got to be something that you can do in a very affordable fashion.
Well, if we look at a basic architecture of what a small and medium business might need, our message here is doing nothing is not an option. You have to do something to get your data off-site, and there are a variety of different things that you can do. I think most folks are going to have the servers, the network, and most likely a WAN already in place for getting to the internet and possibly communicating between two sites. We at Drobo naturally let folks know that reliable storage for your primary site is an important thing because availability starts with your primary storage. You got to make sure that it's highly available and ready to go. But in terms of offsite storage, there's really three main ideas that a small and medium business might have, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The key thing is to make sure that you have this stuff in place to make sure that, and it kind of goes to what you said earlier, that in all likelihood, the chances of your facility flooding are relatively low. So you want to make sure the stuff that can happen on a day-to-day basis, like a drive failure, you've got that well protected. And then finally, you need to get it out of the building for that rare instance. And what I always highlight here is that despite the fact that it's a rare instance, the effect of that rare instance actually occurring is so great, you've got to take some steps to plan for it.
Yep. And I think that right now a lot of folks are interested in cloud-based backup because they see that as a fairly prolifically available solution. A lot of companies are out marketing those services. Offsite vaulting, I think, is the way folks had done it in the past, and it certainly still works today, tried and true. Are you carrying any tapes home, George?
No. Yeah, we copy everything to a remote site that we own. I think cloud has its role, but more really as an archival standpoint, because it's not so much cloud backup that I get concerned about; it's cloud recovery.
Right.
And so, and again, there are ways to work around that. You just need to make sure you ask the right questions. And the first question would be, if my server goes down, what do you do? Because you're not pulling all that across the wire.
Absolutely. It takes us to this comparison chart that we show here. A lot of words on the slide, so apologies for that. We'll walk through some of the major points here. Looking at the contrast between replicating files between sites, cloud-based backup, and off-site tape vaulting, all of them have a similar recovery point. That is, the last time you did the backup operation. And from a recovery time perspective, that's where I think the distinction is. And you mentioned that going from tape, restoring from tape can be quite slow because first you have to get the tapes back to your site, or that you have to get them to a site where you have a server and a tape drive that can restore them. But then you have to go through that recovery process. And as a longtime guy in the data center, I myself have always had challenges testing my recovery process because restoring from tape can be very stressful. Talk to us about the differences in recovery time, because I think that's where the biggest distinction is between these three technologies.
Yeah, I think the word that constantly jumps out at me on this slide is redirection, in that you can go right to your data as opposed to having to do something with your data before you can get to it. And that was really our problem. The story I told at the beginning, that was really our problem. Is it was on a disk. It was just in the wrong format and had to be recovered and go across the network and all kinds of things like that. The redirection thing is a key capability. So that's I think that's really the key point, that you don't have to necessarily. You may have to move data, but you don't need to change data to get access to it. Depending on how you set it up, you may not even have to move data. And then the cloud-based backup, most of the providers will do some sort of ship type of thing, like put it on a plane or something like that. But that comes generally with a pretty decent expense. certainly recovering an entire server across the WAN is beyond impractical.
One thing that's fair to say, though, about file replication between sites, we're positioning it here as a great solution for small and medium businesses that want to have quick recovery while benefiting from offsite backup, is that if a file gets corrupted, file replication can very successfully replicate all files to the next site. So you really can't just have one solution here. There probably needs to be a combination of both to protect from, a disaster and get quick recovery while also having that archival.
Yeah, what we tend to recommend is you want something to get you back to the very latest moment in time, and then you want something that has some versioning, if you will, to be able to dial back, a couple of levels and find the version that doesn't get corrupted.
Right. And one approach might be then to use file replication as your first line of defense for offsite backup, and then use either cloud or tape vaulting as your long-term archival, smaller in size, less frequent, thus reducing some of the cost and maybe some of the complexity, and then you keep the first line of defense there for your rapid restore capabilities.
Yeah, that's exactly what we do internally now.
One of the things that I found interesting in doing a little research for this, George, was that the monthly cost, it can be quite large if you start to add everything up. And I think when it comes to doing solutions like file replication, people look at the cost of the hardware up front as a capital expense, but they don't understand how that relates in operating expense to what other solutions might be. What I've shown here is that for a second storage device for your file replication, you could lease that second storage device. While it has $2,500, $3,000 price tag if you were to buy it up front, the monthly lease is less than $100. And if you're comparing that to other solutions and their monthly costs, it's not overly expensive. In fact, if you think about it, it could be less expensive to go with that solution.
Yeah, I that's a really good way to frame that up, too, because I think that one of the initial attractions of anything cloud-based is that you kind of put things in a monthly perspective. And I think that it's advisable for customers to do the exact same thing with the capital expenditures that they might make and compare the two, because they might be surprised that the cost of that cloud-based storage, the only problem with pay-as-you-grow is you keep growing. That means you keep paying more. And so you've got to factor that into the overall equation.
The idea here is that smaller companies, if they don't have a reliable restore strategy and you're not putting data off-site, you really need to look into doing that, because it is an important thing. And no matter how you go about doing it, there are some cost-effective ways to do it. The monthly cost we're showing here for cloud-based backup is for a terabyte of data. So if your needs are smaller than a terabyte in terms of your backup size, then that monthly cost naturally would go down. A lot of the monthly cost around tape vaulting is in the tapes and in the frequency that you have those tapes picked up. So there's not a lot of opportunity with the smaller amount of data to save there. But certainly that is possible with the cloud-based backup. The requirements for an SMB offsite backup. We talked a little bit about these already. And you mentioned that a real copy, meaning you can use it without having to do a restore, and that you can access it directly. In the case of either cloud or file replication, you can just get one file. You don't have to restore the whole darn thing. If you're looking for just one file, that can be relatively quick. But give us your guidance on simplicity versus complexity, because a lot of steps in a restore process can add for some risk and make it unreliable. The net is that for SMBs, you got to keep it simple in order for it to work. Talk about what some of the pitfalls could be in a more complex solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just on the accessibility thing, the other thing that I like to point out is from a testing perspective, it's a lot easier. Most people that do backups and put it into, let's call it a backup format, tend to have less confidence in their ability to recover because you can't visualize the data, for lack of a better word, where if it's in a real format, you can just go look at it, launch the application on the secondary box, and know whether or not it's going to work. So that I think that's the real ability with accessibility, is also a testing component. As far as complexity goes, complexity hits you at all angles. First of all, it delays rollout and certainly incurs hidden cost. You'll complex solutions will tend to stretch bandwidth, find problems in your WAN links, things like that. But probably the more important thing that we kind of talked about a little earlier is the complex processes just aren't followed. And when we're talking about something as important as DR, again, I go back to the fact that it worked last week and didn't work today isn't as valuable, right? Now, you may be able to use last week's copy, shoestring some restores together and get real close, but you'll probably lose some time. If you go back a month, you might be in a situation that becomes very costly and maybe business threatening. So why we really promote simplicity, and I would give up some capability to have a more simple solution, is that simple solutions tend to be consistently performed. And in disaster recovery, I think consistency is the most important feature, because if you're not doing it all the time, it's just not going to work for you. And then finally, typically when we see complex systems that move data in a complex fashion, moving that data back and recovering it is not surprisingly equally complex, right? And again, you want to, in a disaster, if you really have had a flood or a fire or whatever, your wits aren't necessarily about you. You're probably not operating at 100%, and you need the system to just work. And having to go through 15 steps to be able to get to access your data is certainly not as valuable as just being able to access your data. So that's really, I think the net line really kind of sums it up pretty nicely, is you just want to be able to plug this thing in, plug it on the other end of your WAN connection, get the two connected, and not have to worry about it, right? And then, again, with the accessibility, be able to test it as frequently as you need to.
Well, George, when it comes to offsite backup, there are some concerns. I think people are always concerned about cost, especially with a data set that continues to expand. They want a solution that they know they can afford today, but can also afford down the road once they buy into an architecture and they're moving down the road. Complexity you've covered very quickly and thoroughly. But from a performance standpoint, there are folks that like the flexibility of the WAN in the cloud, but getting a large amount of data back from the cloud can be kind of slow. So how do you recommend that folks look at file replication as a way to work around some of these concerns?
Sure. Well, one of the advantages with file replication is there's two components, right? There's let's call it the initial seed and then the recovery. The initial seed, you can bring, let's say you're using a dual box replication strategy, you can bring both boxes to the primary location first, sync them up, and then ship the DR box to your remote site or wherever you're going to put it. So that really takes care of the initial seed, and then once those two boxes connect together again, the only thing that has to be sent is the changes that happen during shipment, so hopefully not a lot. So that really takes care of the seeding issue and generally one that people are concerned with. The recovery one is probably a little bigger, and you've got several options, and again, it goes back to this accessibility thing. First thing you could do is just access it from the remote site. With server virtualization and the capabilities that brings nowadays, you could pretty easily, on a single box in a remote site, have all your applications in a paused virtual machine status ready to go. So that's one option. Another option would be if it's a unit failure in the local site, you could just have that box shipped down to you or driven down, depending on what the distance is. So that's sort of the flexibility. The other thing that you can do with the data robotics solution in particular is you can actually just ship the drives, which would save you a little bit of money on shipping as well. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And that really is important because another challenge that we really haven't touched on with DR is you don't know what disaster is going to hit you. I always laugh when people will say, "Hey, we're planning for a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever." Well, it's almost like you can guarantee yourself that's the one thing that won't happen to you. So you need flexibility to respond to whatever the given challenge is.
As we put the solution together, George, I've got a configuration here with 8 terabytes at the primary and the remote, and you may not need 8 terabytes total, but it shows you from a scalability standpoint that you could put a solution like this in place today, and for the cost of scaling up hard drives, you could go up to a full 16 terabytes both at your primary and remote in a very cost-effective way. We get questions a lot whether this is just for files or whether you could use your backup server to put backups onto your file storage and then take advantage of the facility to replicate those backup copies to your other site. So we wanted to let folks know that it's not just directly accessing files on the primary file sharing device. Anything that you put on that file sharing device will be replicated to the other side, whether it's local backups or accessing those files. You talked about incremental being an important part of the solution. Only the new files or changes within existing files get moved over to the other side. And from a validation perspective, there's technology built in to validate the integrity of every file copy to make sure that the sync is a perfect copy on both sides and you have a reliable ability to recover that file. Looking at the numbers, you can get a great solution from a very well-known vendor in the marketplace, a 6-slot system that's a business class type device, rack mountable. Put one on either side, and for about 8 terabytes on either side, it's about $10,000 US. At Drobo, we're constantly looking at ways to make these type of solutions more affordable so that folks who have traditionally been prevented from doing these things because of cost get the access to those technologies so they can make their solutions, in this case offsite backup, even better. And the price we have out there for a pair of Drobo Pro FS boxes with our Drobo Sync solution, 8 terabytes in each of those, just over $5,000 US, or about half the cost of the comparable solution. And with that, a little bit more scalability, 2 more slots, and the ability to put 2 terabyte, if not 3 terabyte drives if you wanted to, there into the future. The general purpose server, a lot of folks who are using file servers today, it's a great way to share up files in your organization. But if you've got a server with direct attached storage that's running out of space, or you don't want to manage that file server any longer, going with a file sharing solution that's storage based can provide some benefits. What would your recommendation be in terms of backup and primary file access? Because the backup copy isn't directly accessible. You'd have to restore that copy. Would you recommend using this type of a sync solution for both native files and backups?
Well, it would depend on how your backup application stored the file. If it creates one big file every time it does a backup, that might be a challenge. What we've done with our Drobo, in fact, is until we put it into production, was we used a synchronization product that just did a file copy from our old file server to the Drobo, and then so the change rate was relatively small. It was just the individual files. I would tend to use that. Those again are becoming increasingly popular, and you know, in a Windows environment, a free utility like RoboCopy does a pretty darn good job at seeding these units. So that's an option. And depending on the backup application, that may be an option as well.
I'm glad you brought that point up, George, because there are no shortage of utilities, pay for and free utilities out there in the marketplace that'll help you move data around. The value of the Drobo Sync solution with Drobo Pro FS really is simplicity. And for more information, you can go to Drobo's website and find information on Drobo Pro FS and Drobo Sync. 5-click setup. You get it set up. It's doing it continuously in the background without you having to touch it ever again. And in the event of needing to get access, you can redirect users to that system at the remote side or transport that system in its whole, or just the drives, as you mentioned, George, back to the primary site and do a very quick restore that way. The value of a file replication solution in this case that's built into the storage is a simplicity case where you can just set it and forget it, or set it and go, as you mentioned before, George. That brings us to a wrap-up, and I'll hit you with a couple of top questions before we open it up to other folks there on the broadcast. What's a realistic time frame, George, for recovery for a small business? The big guys always say, I want to be up in an hour. Is that something that's realistic for a small, medium business? Should they be aiming for a day? What do you normally tell folks?
Well, I hate to take with the political season behind us, I hate to take the politician's answer, but it really just depends on your business. You know, in most cases, an hour or more is going to be fine, but you know, you have to look at what your particular needs are. So again, going back to us, we like to make sure that the website shows an update every 4 hours. Will the world end if it takes 8? Absolutely not. And you know, if my office caught on fire, I probably have more important things to worry about than updating the website that particular day. So you've got to kind of base sort of what you want with, you know, what reality is and what the true consequences would be. So I would say for most small businesses, certainly certainly beyond an hour, at least half a day, maybe even a day, depending on the application.
How about proximity? How far apart should locations be? You mentioned you don't want them across the street. Inside the same metro area can probably be okay, though, if maybe one of the officer of the company's houses is far enough away from the primary site, or you do have another office that's anywhere there. I think folks are just, they don't want to put them too close. So how far would you say is a good distance?
Well, the only problem I'd have with putting it at the officer of the company's location is he'd probably end up using, they end up liking the Drobo so much they ended up using it for all their iTunes storage. But,
right.
What we like to do is survive a what I would call a metro type of disaster. So if your office is downtown, most major metropolitan areas have a secondary employment center that's on the outskirts of town. I like to recommend a lowland, upland sort of strategy. So, and I don't know why, but it seems like all downtowns are the most easy to get flooded. So make sure your secondary site, if you can arrange it, is on higher ground, and that tends to be one of the big things. Fire, you're going to survive if it's any distance at all away. The only other concern would be a regional power outage, but again, that falls into the sort of act of God stuff that people tend to forgive you for.
Right. All right. In terms of bandwidth, I think folks can get concerned if they have very large files that need to be synchronized between two sites. Do you run into a choke point if you have a relatively small circuit that you're provisioned out to your WAN and communication between your two sites? Have you had any experience with testing on this, or other clients that are doing replication and they're having success, maybe even at T1 or the smaller WAN circuits?
Yeah, I think, again, it sort of depends. It depends on, the big one would be the size of files, right, and the frequency that they change. So, you're recording this webcast. Generally, those run 50 to 100 megs. That's a pretty good haul for for a small connection. But nowadays, even files that are in the half gig to 2 gig range can transmit pretty quickly across what we consider to be modest connections nowadays. So certainly I wouldn't want to put my entire Exchange store on it or the things like that. But as long as it is discrete, meaning segmentable, you could put the Library of Congress on it as long as the entire library doesn't change all day, right? So. That's really the big thing, is how often does it change and what are the size of those changes. For most small businesses, even again, what we would consider a modest connection seems to work pretty well. And really, generally, the only negative to this is the time that it takes to get to the other side of the equation there. And if it's going to take an hour or two to replicate a particularly heavy change day, and we've just said that it's okay to be out for a day, generally you're probably going to be okay then.
Right. A lot of folks can schedule these synchronization jobs between the two sites during their off-peak hours when their WAN has the most capacity available. It's probably the time that you're doing your backups anyway. So for folks that are looking to schedule that, you can do that in off hours. For people who want to be snapping copies and syncing them continuously throughout the day, that's also possible. You mentioned that as long as the data is not changing very often, those can be very small syncs. And in the event that you do have a large sync, you can set up some quality of service on your WAN to make sure that your voice over IP traffic or other more mission critical connections aren't getting contended with the sync operation in the background. I think it's just a best practice that you'd probably recommend folks schedule those things for at night when you're probably doing your backups anyway.
Yeah, I would tend to use the QoS thing during the day and then schedule the complete update at night just to make sure I'm totally covered.
All right, with that, backup's a must, folks, and I think that every SMB knows that they need to do something, and they want to have a simple approach in doing it. In this broadcast, we looked into file storage solutions that have synchronization built in, and they can be acquired at an affordable cost, and in often cases lower than tape vaulting or cloud-based backup if you look at the cost on a monthly basis, comparing that operational expense versus the capital expense. Drobo Pro FS, specifically with the Drobo Sync feature, offers a simple and affordable remote backup solution that also provides for rapid recovery, whether you need to access one file at the remote site, whether you need to redirect all your users to your remote site and make it a new primary, or transported in the event of taking the secondary, moving it back to the primary. All of those can be done more quickly than comparable solutions of tape vaulting or cloud-based backup. So with that, we're going to go ahead and open up the lines for some general questions and answers. One of the questions that someone has here is about performance, because file server systems may not be as fast as an iSCSI SAN or even direct attached storage, George, to a backup server. So is there a concern with a file server having some limited performance with the primary user access of that file storage?
I don't. I mean, I guess there's a number of ways you could come up with a performance issue. I think in the market that we're talking about, I don't think it's typically a real problem. No.
Just for smaller users, I mean, we've talked about simplicity. Putting something in place that satisfies requirements but makes it simple is probably better than storage. We at Drobo are always finding that folks have been conditioned over the years to look at storage with performance being the number one criteria and everything else second. In this case, though, it's probably more of a balanced scorecard, or even performance may not be one of the key criteria.
Yeah, because performance is only good if you can actually use it. If you can't use it, you're just wasting money, essentially. So I think a balance is the right approach.
Here's a question. There's one of the folks is asking, they're using Acronis or Storecraft to make some images of servers and storing them on NAS storage. And the problem they're having is that they get new files that are big every day. How are people working around image-based backup if they want to put those images off-site?
You know, in that situation, you've got to be careful at the level at which you're replicating, because you're going to end up having to transmit the whole net new image. There are utilities that will just update the changed components of the file, but that's probably, in that scenario, that's probably more of a different type of solution than what we're talking about today.
If you lose sync, or if you lose the connection between the two sides, someone's talking about another product that they currently have that seems to get out of sync because they lose the network and it becomes a hassle. The question is, what happens to a Drobo if it loses sync? In the case of Drobo, the secondary unit, which is the destination for the Drobo sync, is an exact copy of your primary. And it's not just the data. It includes the shares, the user information, all of the device settings, everything gets copied over there. So losing your connection between the two sides simply means that the secondary unit is up to date as of its last completed sync. So if you missed a sync after 24 hours, the next time it was scheduled to run, you would go ahead and have probably a couple more changes to sync up, but that you could pick up right where it had previously left off in the past, or you could also go on demand and schedule a sync to happen just about any time. If you know that your WAN happened to have a problem during the night when it was supposed to run normally, you can go ahead and kick it off if you wanted to do that. But the way file replication technology works, it kind of helps prevent from this out-of-sync issue, right, George? Because it's like a point-in-time copy.
Yeah, absolutely. In this technology, it would just keep track of what's changing, and then if, let's say it had 100 things to replicate, and on thing number 48 it stopped, when the link came back up, it would just pick up, it would rescan and say, oh, I've got 50 things out of sync, I'll just sync those up. So it's pretty straightforward.
Another question has to do with one-to-one versus one-to-many. It's a question that we quite often get here. And George, the Drobo solution that we have here is specifically one-to-one. It's designed that way to make recovery the absolute quickest and easiest possible. And we've designed the solution in a cost-affordable way that allows you to put that in place. And we don't allow a many-to-many type of replication solutions. There's a lot of them out there. Have you played with any of those that allow the many-to-many? And what is some advice that you have with working with some of those? Because they can be more complicated and make for a more complicated restore process. Yeah,
I think the many-to-many, again, probably is beyond is more of a mid-range type of solution, number one. And they certainly do add layers of complexity to make sure that you've got to make sure you're syncing the right parts to the right part in that standpoint. And so it's, while vendors have done, I think, a pretty good job of making that technology more approachable and certainly more solid, it certainly is a more detailed setup, and it's something you can't just plug in and go like we have described with the DroboSync.
One last question here we'll take before we wrap up is for incremental backups, does it recopy the entire file or does it calculate just the changes and send those over? Most file replication solutions that you've evaluated, George, would do the latter, copy just the changes, and the same is with DroboSync. Do you find that that incremental change makes for a smaller amount of data that actually gets transmitted? Because people might be touching very large files during the day, but they may not see a large amount of data going across.
Right, yeah. If you can just replicate the components that have changed, you're going to save a tremendous amount of WAN bandwidth. And the software has to be intelligent enough to know what has changed and what hasn't, and then, obviously only send those changes, and also be able to see the difference between a view, right, an open versus a actual modification.
Fantastic. Well, that brings us up to a wrap now for today's broadcast. For those who ask questions, we'll make sure that we respond to each one of you individually, as well as post a transcript of all the Q&A on our website at drobo.tv. If you have any additional questions, you can send them to us at tv@drobo.com or hit us on Twitter at Drobo, and you can subscribe to our podcast feed as well and get all of our episodes that we've recorded, to include one we did with you back in September, George, that had to do with VMware high availability and using the Essentials Plus license for an iSCSI SAN solution. So any last comments, George? And thank you for joining us today.
Oh, well, again, thanks for having me. I keep going back to when we're talking about this, especially in the SMB space. This is a pretty powerful capability, allows SMBs to really protect their data. And what I find is that data loss to a small business is just as critical as it is to a large business. In fact, you could even make the case that it's worse because they don't have the manpower and staffing to recreate data. So take it seriously and look for solutions that can go in simply and work consistently.
All right. Thank you, our participants in today's program, for asking a bunch of questions. We may have got to 20 or 30% of those, so we'll make sure we answer those online. And we look forward to seeing you on our next broadcast. Thanks again, George.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Until next time, folks, happy sharing.